Okay, well, thank you very much for inviting us. My name is Mick Clarke, and this is Kevin Hyland. A little bit more about us in a moment, but I thought it would be really nice to begin this session with a quote from Pope Francis, and the quote is displayed here. Pope Francis said, "Human trafficking is an open wound on the body of contemporary society, a scourge upon the body of Christ. It is a crime against humanity." So in this session, we'd like to share our thoughts around the links between modern slavery and homelessness. But just before we get into that, some introductions. So my name's Mick Clarke. I'm the Chief Executive of The Passage, and that is one of our buildings in London. More about The Passage in a moment. But I'm also joined by Kevin Hyland. Kevin has longer titles than me. Kevin has been the UK's first independent anti-slavery commissioner. He was a key person in the Santa Marta group, including playing a lead role in securing the Sustainable Development Goal 8.7 at the United Nations, committing to ending modern slavery. And he's just been elected as Ireland's independent member of the Council of Europe Anti-Trafficking Committee. But most importantly, he's a Passage trustee. So we're really very pleased to be here with you. So what we want to do with this workshop is tell you a little bit about the Passage, give a bit of an overview of the global picture around modern slavery at the moment, and the links with homelessness. I want to give you some headlines around the work that the Passage has been doing around modern slavery and homelessness. And then we'd like to open it up to a question and answer session where we can have a conversation and then all together try to come up with some tangible next steps that we can play as Vincentians around this issue. Does that sound okay? So a little bit about the Passage. So the Passage was established in 1980 by Cardinal Basil Hugh, who was the Archbishop of Westminster, and the wonderful Daughters of Charity. And the Daughters of Charity still live in this building which the Passage run. And this is one of our buildings. And we run day services for homeless people. About 150 people a day coming. Everything from getting food, clothing, showers, through to helping to accommodation, helping to employment. We also do a lot of medical work as well, around primary health needs, but also mental health and substance misuse and alcohol. We run a number of accommodation projects, and we also do homelessness prevention schemes as well. The main focuses, really, of the Passage are twofold. One is we are built on our Vincentian roots. So everything that we do, we try to do in the spirit of Vincent, to be seeing everybody as an individual that deserves to be treated with respect and dignity and who has potential. And we also do something else that's very Vincentian, and that's work around systemic change. And we do that in two ways. Systemic change around the individual. So if somebody has a drug or an alcohol issue, we work with that person to deal with that issue so they can break out of the cycle of homelessness for good. And also on a macro, a larger level, by liaising with both local government and central government to bring about policy changes to work towards ending street homelessness. We have a mixed success in that. But one of the areas that we've moved on to just recently is around modern slavery, because we were increasingly seeing people arriving at our door who'd either been targeted by people trying to coerce them into modern slavery whilst they were vulnerable on the street, or people who'd been victims of modern slavery that had escaped and had ended up on the streets. And so we decided to do some work on that and to look at what we can do. That's Kerry from Ireland. And can I just point out that when Kerry was doing her presentation, I thought, I'm not going to come in halfway because I might disturb them. You're very welcome. So I'm going to hand over to Kevin now, just to give a little bit of a global picture about the state of play of modern slavery at the moment.
Thank you, Mick. And can I start by thanking all the people in the room, particularly the religious sisters, who I've worked with for a number of years on the issue of human trafficking and modern slavery. And I think when we look at the work that they do, the risks that they take, it's a lesson to us all about humility, dignity, and compassion for others, because often those qualities are missing in the world, which is probably the reason why human trafficking exists, because those qualities have been replaced by greed, selfishness, and, to a degree, control. But when we talk about human trafficking and modern slavery, I think one of the issues really is the numbers. And when we think that 40 million people are in human trafficking or modern slavery today, that brings shame on us as a society. Brings shame on us that we have allowed this to happen. As the current incumbents of this global community, this is our fault. And once we accept the blame, then we have the responsibility to end it, to eradicate it. And as Pope Francis has said, it has to be ended in our time. So the fact this is here is because we have become a society that looks on people as a commodity. We look on things as disposable, which now includes people. But how do we actually change that? And if we look at the fact that in the times of the transatlantic slave trade, in the whole 200-year period, there was a maximum of 15 million people who were in slavery, the fact that there is 40 million today is shocking. And the fact that there are 151.5 million children in forced labour situations says a lot about our society and the value we have of people. Now, in 2015, there was the Sustainable Development Goals, and these were launched at the United Nations by Pope Francis, a commitment of what the world will do to eradicate these crimes. And of those 17 goals, they all talk about values, about the way we treat the environment, the way we treat people. But one of the things that I've raised recently is that we cannot achieve these goals, particularly the target of eradicating human trafficking and modern slavery, if governments are still funding it. And by that I mean that the taxpayers' money in supply chains actually ends up in the hands of the criminals when governments are trading. So, for example, the G20 actually meet later this week in Argentina. And I went there with a group, which is a faith-based group, very much led by the Catholic Church, and we are demanding that governments ensure that our taxpayers' money does not end up in the hands of people in modern slavery. And people say that's really difficult. How can we make sure that the mines of the Congo don't have children down them who live and die down there when they are mining for our mobile phones, for the batteries that power them? Well, this year, from London to Australia, there has been the introduction of a direct flight. That plane will fly for 30 years on that route. And through its lifetime, we will know where every passenger came from, how they paid, what fuel was used, the whole maintenance of that flight, who the crew were, and how often it was in the air and for how long. So don't tell me we can't tell where the children who mined the products to make that aircraft come from. To me, it is achievable if we decide we're going to achieve it. So one of the things we need to call on is the global governments, and 80% of our global economy sits in those G20 countries. And 1 in 5 units of currency in the world is spent by a government on procurement. So we need to actually look at things like the monies that our governments, including our developed nations governments, spend. So what makes this situation worse? Well, we've got 65.6 million people displaced around the world who are actually treated just like, again, a commodity. The world sits by why people are still arriving in the southern part of this country, why they're still arriving in Greece, and policies are introduced that actually just push them away as opposed to reach out to help them. So we need a change in those policies. We need a change in the positioning of how we treat people. And if we do that as a global community, and we as members of this global community start to ask for that, then of course we can start to see some change in the Sustainable Development Goals. SDG 8.7, getting that in place was a big task. And of course, when I was asking for it, and this was drafted in my office, it wasn't going to go very far, albeit that I asked the UN, I asked then the Home Secretary, Theresa May, and all thought it was a good idea. But it was Pope Francis himself who assisted to get that SDG on the table. And it was on the last day of the drafting of those goals that that was agreed. And it was the only amendment to the goals. So we in this room have a responsibility to that goal. But look at one part of it. By 2025, 7 years' time, we will end child labour and child soldiers. So we need to be aware that not much is happening to achieve these goals on the global stage. We need to be demanding that governments and those with responsibility make sure that they do all they can and we hold them to account. And recently, when I've looked at what the Catholic Church is doing, and particularly religious sisters, they are doing more to achieve these goals, perhaps, than some of the wealthiest nations in the world. So there is an example set that they can follow and look at and examine. So it's important that when we do anything, we think about communities. I've just spoken about some of the big opportunities and perhaps some of the big targets that we can achieve and we can demand. And if you think about what's happened recently, a case that I saw was a young girl who actually demanded that a company change the way it purchased sporting goods. And she took that on, she spoke to people, and eventually she managed to get to the chief executive of one of the biggest companies in the world and made that demand. And she alone changed the way that company started doing business. So one person, one young girl with determination can make that change. And in fact, me saying that to religious sisters, your orders have all been started by one young person who was once a young girl who had a vision, and many years on, many hundreds of years on in some cases, that vision is still being realised and delivered. So it is up to us as individuals to come collectively and demand that these changes happen. But when I go to Nigeria, as that picture is, and I see what is happening there now, through the work of religious sisters and the Catholic Church and others working now with the state to actually make sure girls aren't travelling who are subject of juju and witchcraft, or when they arrive in Europe they're supported when they arrive into communities where there is a response. But all too often they've gone through situations, for example in Libya, where I met young girls who had been raped 15 times a day in order to earn their passage across the Mediterranean. And then when they arrived in southern Italy, were then excluded from any support. And the objective was just to return them back to where they came from, not to look after them for their vulnerability. So the criminals have got the upper hand. And the criminals are operating a lot more dynamically than the actual organisations that are fighting this, particularly the state organisations. So the Santa Marta Group was formed, an unusual group of the police and the church working together, and now we see what it is delivering in Nigeria. In Argentina, the Catholic Church, through the Bishops' Conference and education there, are delivering training to every single police officer, as from next year, who joins the Argentinian National Police, a country where there had been no trust between state and church. This is how things can change. In Mozambique, the religious sisters are working with the law enforcement to actually start to combat and challenge the trafficking of children for their organs. In Italy, there are programs now in place about working on trafficking with religious sisters and the law enforcement. much of it pushed by the Vatican police themselves. In Greece, there is projects now working with the church, and that is moving on to the Orthodox Church, who want to follow the example of Pope Francis. And if we look in Ireland, where there is a project now run with An Garda Síochána, the Irish police, and the Department of Justice, and the Police Service of Northern Ireland, and the Department of Justice on both sides of the border, looking at the impact of trafficking. And obviously, a part of that, and an important part, is St Mary's University, Mary Immaculate University, a Catholic university, and Religious Sisters in Ireland. And this is looking at probably what will happen after March next year, and how collectively they can still tackle this. So the church has brought forward some great initiatives in order to tackle this. But until we actually start to reduce this crime is actually increasing. We need to make sure that efforts are concerted. I believe the church has a major role to play in that, from the learning of the religious sisters in particular, but to upscale that so that we are actually taking the fight to the criminals and not just responding after the events have happened. Once again, I want to thank you all for your assistance over the years. I look forward to working with many of you in the future, now in my role at the Council of Europe and other positions that I'm holding, but particularly working with Mick Clarke and the Passage and with homeless people, which is the common theme that runs through trafficking. All the people that I've met who have been trafficked, which is many over the years, have all been absence of a home. And if we can make sure people's homes are where they are, or where they come from, or where they travel to, then we actually disempower the traffickers. Because when they've got a home and they feel loved and they're part of a community, the traffickers will not win. And that's the part that we need to make sure every human being has, so that they are no longer a commodity. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Kevin. So, just bringing it back to the passage, Kevin made the point there of homelessness is like a common denominator that runs through modern slavery. And certainly that's what we were seeing. We would see people being approached on the streets, because wherever there is vulnerability, there will be people there seeking to take advantage. So people who are on the streets being coerced to be part of modern slavery, people escaping modern slavery itself. And we even had a couple of occasions where people pretended to be homeless to get into that building that I showed you earlier, to pretend to be homeless to try and peddle their wares. So Kevin's office commissioned the Passage to produce a report into the links between modern slavery and homelessness. So we liaised with 61 organisations across the United Kingdom who were working with homeless people. And out of those 61, 64% said that they had encountered modern slavery in terms of work with their homeless clients. So our report that we put forward had 3 broad findings and recommendations. So these were very much focusing on the UK, but I'm sure can be actually from a global perspective considered as well. So the first was training and awareness, particularly thinking about awareness amongst the homeless population themselves. So getting the word out that this is a real risk if you are on the streets, that if something sounds too good to be true, it probably is. But getting that awareness out for the street population. But also providing awareness amongst frontline homelessness staff who are working either in centres or going out onto the streets, and giving them adequate training. One of the big frustrations that frontline staff would have about this is a feeling of not knowing what to do. I think something's wrong here, but I'm not sure. I don't know what to do. So having that basic training. And also making sure that, again, the frontline staff had assessment tools. So tools that they could use to actually make an assessment of whether they think somebody was a victim of modern slavery or not. And the appropriate support around what to do if they thought that someone was. Who do they refer them to? And then finally, under training and awareness, raising awareness amongst the general public. People will walk past people begging, people will walk past people sleeping out on the streets, to have the general public aware that actually these people could be being targeted. The second recommendation was around data collection, looking at how recording systems, and certainly say in London, in the homelessness sector, there is like a database that is used that most of the mainstream providers use and record information on and share it. So making sure that those systems were tracking incidents of modern slavery and making sure those systems were consistent. Looking also at when somebody is referred into the government scheme, which is called the National Referral Mechanism, kind of framework of support for someone who is a victim of modern slavery, that they too were recording whether they were from a homelessness background. And also looking at the role of local government and local authorities when liaising and visiting and monitoring homelessness providers to make sure that they were talking about modern slavery as well. And one of the things only the other day that the police published a report around the West Midlands in the UK, and there was just over 400 victims of modern slavery that had gone into this national referral mechanism. And in that area, 69 of those were homeless. Now that's quite a sizable percentage. So the final recommendation under the data collection was more research to be done under this, because we've only just touched on this. And the final recommendation was more partnership working. And there is a wonderful quote about partnership working that I love, and it's from an American president. I can guarantee you it's not the current one. But it's inspiring, and it's about, he was talking about politics, but you can apply it to leadership as well. And he said, there's nothing that you can't achieve in politics or leadership as long as you don't mind who gets the credit. And I thought, isn't that so Vincentian? All about servant leadership. Partnership working is so hard, or genuine partnership working, I should say. So our recommendations around partnership working were around the government working closer with providers. We're seeing a lot of people who are on the streets before they enter into that framework of support, but also people who end up homeless when they leave that framework of support as well. More multi-agency partnership working, whether it's the voluntary sector or the statutory sector. And really looking at how homelessness charities and modern slavery charities can work closer together as well. Just before opening up to a question and answer session, we did the report, thankfully through funding of some wonderful people called the London Housing Foundation. We've got funding for a post, an anti-slavery coordinator, who's about 5 months in post at the Passage, and is already seeing the level of challenge that is out there. So out of the, I'd say about 20 clients that we saw who were absolutely victims of modern slavery in those first few months, over 80% of those, it's taken an age to get them off the streets and into safe accommodation. So the system just, in the UK, just isn't working in terms of actually getting people who are vulnerable and off the streets. We're seeing, as I said earlier, a lot of people coming to the end of that support network and also then ending up on the streets. And we're also about to launch what we're calling a navigator scheme, to really look at when people are in that situation, they can have an advocate, a navigator, to help them navigate the bureaucracy that is out there. So nothing really mind-blowing here, nothing shocking, nothing too radical, just common sense really recommendations that we believe need to be taken forward. But it comes back to the point I made about the Passage around systemic change. We're really serious around wanting to end street homelessness. There's no magic bullet to that. And it's the same with modern slavery. you have to really focus on making sure that everyone has a role in this, and that we challenge, as Kevin was saying, the governments, and that we simply don't allow this anymore. So we thought that we'd open it up, because we've got about 15 minutes, to a question and answer. I think there's a roving mic. And what would be lovely is, at the end of this, we have some ideas, but to look at some tangible steps and outcomes that we as Vincentians could take away and take back around what we could be doing around modern slavery and homelessness. So let's just open this up. And if anybody has any questions, please feel free. And there is a mic over here, I think. Sorry. Try and turn it on. That's it. Anybody have a question at all?
Just one practical one. What's the difference between... Mike, it's just a practical question over the difference between what you do and the Cardinal Hume Centre. Sorry.
The Cardinal Hume Centre does tend to be more younger people, and also focusing more on refugees. We tend to be everyone, really. Ian. This is what happens when you walk in late.
Mike, first of all, just a thank you to you and Kevin for really raising the awareness of this issue back in the UK and now hopefully beyond you. You've done a sterling job getting up the agenda. A baby question. Modern slavery and trafficking, is it the same thing? And then I also wonder about the interlink between so for example, in the UK, a lot of the people that we know on the streets are from Romania. I do wonder if they're being exploited by people from Romania. Is that link true? Or are they being exploited by other groups, or both?
So the term modern slavery was a term chosen by the United Kingdom because it explains what it is. When you talk about human trafficking, you think about movement. And actually under the Palermo Protocol, which is where the legislation for human trafficking comes from the United Nations, you don't have to have the movement. It's the conditions that you treat somebody in, so they can be stationary and in slave-like or servitude conditions. So the UK decided to take the term modern slavery because it was a better term to explain it. However, that has caused a lot of academia to have discussions around, there's no international definition of modern slavery, but there's actually no international definition of terrorism or rape or a number of other things. So yeah, modern slavery and human trafficking are really one in the same. The issue you ask about around the Roma and the Romanians and wider Roma community as well, not just Romanians, there are gangs that are moving them from Romania and from other parts of Europe into the UK, and they get moved seasonally as well, so they might be in Paris at a certain time, they may then be in London, they may be in Ireland, so there's quite a well-organised network, and you will see people, actually, if you look at it in a different lens, that are out on the streets, and you can just tell, how did they end up here? How did they get that spot? How did they get that plot? It's a high-end plot. And there was a case in Ireland where they did that. There was media followed people around, and they saw it was an organised network. Ireland, for example, has been downgraded by the US State Department that assesses countries in the Palermo Protocol in the UN every 2 years because it hadn't had a single prosecution. And it wasn't supporting victims that well. So they're trying to get themselves out of that predicament. But yeah, I mean, there are gangs that will do that, find people, use them as homeless, and in some parts of the world, children are used in that very same way. In the UK, children are very much used for running drugs, and that's British kids as well as foreign kids. So criminals will use people as a commodity, whether it's sexual exploitation, forced labour, domestic servitude. It can be construction sites in Canary Wharf, where it's happened, some of the most wealthy parts of the UK. It can be some of the most expensive houses in diplomatic households. And it can be women and girls and boys and men from anywhere in the world. Even people trafficked on the promise of playing for Premier League or top football teams. So the criminals are very, very adaptive.
Any other questions that anyone may have? Are you all really tired? I think there's one over here. Oh, two. Thanks.
I'm just wondering, apart from raising awareness among organised groups and interested parties, how do we get it out to people in the street? Like someone, they could be passing someone that's traffic. What do they do? How do they react? Who do they tell? And how do we make that known?
So, there are these different measures that have been created. In the UK, for example, it's become quite a complex patchwork of who do you tell. The simple thing I say is, who would you tell if you saw someone committing any other crime? What would you do? And there is obviously, many that would say, well, maybe the victim doesn't want the police to be informed or the authorities be informed. Maybe you raise the risk. We really wouldn't say that about domestic violence. We wouldn't say that about an armed robbery. We wouldn't say that about some other crime. So there are groups that have latched onto this. Now, if you live in Nigeria or somewhere else in the world, you may not want the authorities to know because they may be part of it. But in our developed worlds, we're not adapting to the response like we should. And, there's many cases where people have suffered in silence for many years because somebody hasn't picked the phone up. In North London, I can tell you of a case of a 7-year-old girl who was kept for 3 years in Wood Green, which is a fairly leafy suburb of London, and she was kept in that house for 3 years. People saw her putting the rubbish out. People saw her cutting the grass as she got bigger. And other kids were going to school. But neighbours thought, is that how foreigners live? These were Romanian. Or should we get involved? Yet, in the same street, when we looked at it, there had been domestic violence incidents and people would call the police immediately. So we need to accept this for what it is. And when the Santa Marta group happened, the first one, the Pope was very clear. He said the church's response is to reach out and help and guide people and protect them and give them that place of sanctity. The police's role is to actually go and catch the criminals and bring justice to those criminals. He didn't mess around with it. He didn't say that it's something other than what it really is. So I think we can take his leadership and follow that.
I just add to that as well, the church has a real role in this. Is there anyone from Poland here? No. We did an awareness exercise a few years ago because on the streets of London we were seeing a lot of Polish people who had come over, perhaps promised the world and they weren't going to get anything. And they were ending up street homeless and in a terrible situation. So we used the church network, and in every parish a letter was read out just explaining that actually if you're going to come to the UK and looking for work, these are the things that you must do to make sure you're not going to be taken advantage of, to make sure that you're not giving someone loads of money and then you find that actually it's been a con. So the church, every parish, has a real role to play, in my view.
And just to build on that, I know it's easy to say call the police, and it's quite difficult sometimes, particularly if you're from a vulnerable community. But that's what part of the Santa Marta is trying to do domestically in countries like the UK and Nigeria, places you might not expect, that build the relationship between the communities and law enforcement. So even if the people won't go themselves to report this, they've got a conduit. And with the chaplains in the UK, for example, it's about they have access to communities. And I remember one time when I was a police officer, I was in Southwark Cathedral, and the bishop there, Pat Lynch, introduced me to somebody from the Filipino embassy who said, we're looking after some people who are trafficked and they're frightened to come forward because they think they'll be deported. I was a police officer. I gave them my assurances that I wouldn't be looking at them for immigration, thinking that there would be 2 or 3 people who turned up at this meeting the following week. There were 67 people. And we managed to support them all. We managed to find the criminals. We managed to get prosecutions. We managed to get them their money back. Some wanted to go home. Some wanted to continue their education. It was difficult, but we managed to deal with the whole situation. So if you can build that trust, and that's the one thing that Cardinal Vincent Nichols always talks about with the Santa Marta group, it's about building trust, particularly in areas where trust is in a vacuum. And as we know in the world at the moment, trust and support is something that is kind of seen as a weakness as opposed to something that should be in us all.
We've got, yeah, you need the. I'm not making any assumptions, but you might need the headphones in Spanish.
I make the assumption.
Hemos escuchado cómo este problema del tráfico de las personas es un problema transnacional que prácticamente se genera en las realidades de conflicto, donde hay más pobreza o donde hay guerras y que luego se llevan a otro sitio. La pregunta es si hay algún protocolo de seguridad para las personas que están trabajando para poder orientar este servicio, porque el tema es complicado y el momento de afrontarlo entra en riesgo los equipos de trabajo o la persona que da la cara frente a este problema. ¿Algún protocolo de seguridad, lo que se ha manejado de acuerdo a la experiencia de ustedes?
So your question really hits what many of the issues are, that we're not looking for this very often in the right situations. And one of the things that I've also been pushing for is that this is part of all peacekeeping and all humanitarian responses, because very often the traffickers get there and start to see the vulnerabilities. What we've got to remember is traffickers just look for vulnerabilities, whether you happen to live in London or whether you live in Laos or whether you live in Bangladesh. And if you look at things like the Rohingya, who are fleeing persecution, the levels of trafficking that are in that route now are incredible and enormous. And Cardinal Bowe spoke of it not that long ago and said what the reality is. And then what happens is peacekeeping goes in there and also humanitarian responses, and they're now building accommodation for these people in Bangladesh, which sounds wonderful. But what they've had to do is recruit more children to build the bricks in the brick kilns. So on one hand, we're helping because we're not thinking across this as we need to. So you're absolutely right. We need to look at this as a whole thing. And that's why I say about governments, because 16 of that 40 million in slavery are in supply chains that we will all be engaging with, whether it's the clothes we wear, the food we eat, the phones we use. And if we can start to clean all that up and start to starve the money and start to get humanitarian responses correct and start to see this in peacekeeping, one thing that Ireland has been doing, very small defence force, it's only got 8,500, but it's known for peacekeeping, is it's training some of the other defence forces around how, when they respond to situations, they look at the well-being of people and identify trafficking. Because sometimes it's about giving the person the resilience themselves, because, these boys that I met in southern Italy, when they thought they were going to go and play for Barcelona and Real Madrid, they really believed it. They were 14 years of age and they thought they were really going to be playing for these football teams, and trying to convince them and educate them that this was not a possibility was quite tough. But it was a program that they needed to go on to realise that these football teams just don't make a phone call or a text and say, come and play for us. But they really believed it, and that was the only hope they had. So we need to take it back to their communities and educate them before they embark on these dangerous missions and then they get picked up en route. But the most important thing we need to do around development is to give them jobs and opportunity and equality where they live. And the world's not doing that very well at the moment. We've got the SDGs, we're spending millions and billions on other things, but we need to be spending it in those places, not cutting down on development budgets, but really at the moment we need to be increasing them. And I live in Ireland, and Ireland is the only country in the world that has increased its development budget. All the other countries are reducing them.
Just to leave you with a couple of thoughts to wrap up, possible next steps, maybe awareness raising across the family, maybe an actual day once a year that actually marks modern slavery, really using the contacts that the Vincentian family have at the UN to really press the UN to make sure that 8.7 is achieved. and also taking the lead of the daughters with their wonderful document, The Boldness of Charity, which committed that every single province across the world for the daughters will have a project addressing modern slavery. So we're going to be around afterwards. Very happy to have a chat. Sorry we've had to rush it at the end. But thank you so much, and we hope that you found that really helpful.